Hey there, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. Have you ever wondered if you could grow mushrooms in your home garden? Right alongside your tomatoes? I hadn't either until recently. Mushrooms have always seemed like this mysterious thing that I never really had the desire to learn about, but now that I've actually started to grow them, I see that they're not nearly as complex as I thought. Today's episode, though, is a little unique. What you'll hear is a conversation that I had with Matt McInnis from North Spore Mushrooms a few months before I planted the mushrooms he sent me to try. As you'll hear, like you possibly, am coming at this as a pure beginner who really knew very little, and I wanted him to walk me through it all. We talked about easy ways to grow mushrooms in our garden beds, mulch, and even our garden paths. We talked about how mushrooms can actually improve your soil and help your plants, what kind of moisture and sunlight they really need and don't need, and then how to cook, preserve, and actually enjoy the mushrooms that you grow, especially if you've never loved them before. Raising my hand here. And I waited to share this episode with you until after I had actually planted my mushroom spawn and had something to report back to you. So after our conversation, I'll return back to you with my initial thoughts as a first-time mushroom grower. I was definitely surprised with what I found. Whether you're brand new to mushrooms or you're just mushroom curious, you'll discover that integrating them into your existing garden might be simpler and more beneficial than you think. Let's dive into my conversation with Matt McInnis of North Spore Mushrooms. Matt, growing mushrooms as a vegetable gardener, what do I need to know about growing mushrooms that's different from growing vegetables?
Sure. I was a vegetable gardener before I started growing mushrooms. And I think the most important thing to realize is that mushrooms are actually incredibly easy to grow. They're not in any way harder than growing plants, and in some ways a lot easier. And by incorporating mushrooms into your garden, you're going to be benefiting your plants. So it's really part of creating this really dynamic and healthy garden ecosystem.
So tell me about how to do that. I saw that on some of your YouTube videos, but how do we integrate mushrooms into our gardens, whether we're looking for like permaculture style or just in an organic garden in general? Like I just planted in my tomatoes and I just mulched them, I think with leaf mulch, but I do have access to wood chips and I have straw. Like, can I plant them there, or do I need to have it in its own space, or either one?
Sure. Yeah. I kind of break it down by 4 different fundamental techniques of incorporating mushrooms into your garden. And some of them are easier and some of them are a little bit more intermediate, but they're all very accessible to beginners. Probably the easiest way to grow mushrooms is to inoculate, and that's the process of adding mushroom spawn, which is the equivalent of seeds, but for mushroom gardeners, it's spawn. But one of the easiest ways is actually mixing spawn into your garden paths. Mushrooms really thrive in shady places, so they are suitable for growing in parts of your garden where you can't grow, tomatoes or peppers or, garden vegetables that need a lot of sunlight. They're kind of nice in that you're able to produce food in some of the parts of your garden that are harder to produce food from. So yeah, the easiest would be growing mushrooms on your garden pads. So wood chip pads, mixing mushroom spawn into it, and then utilizing, being able to grow food from where you probably wouldn't be growing food otherwise. You can also mix spawn into straw and then use that to mulch plants. And then you can grow mushrooms from the mulch around your plants. Or you can make kind of a dedicated mushroom bed in this method. So you can, imagine making like a small raised bed, filling it with wood chips, and then inoculating the wood chips with mushroom spawn. So all 3 of those are sort of like different ways that you're kind of making a mushroom bed. You're either using your paths, you're using your mulch around your plants, or you're dedicating a bed to it. I should also mention the other one would be if you have perennial bushes or shrubs that you mulch, you can also grow edible mushrooms underneath your perennial shrubs, even if they're not technically part of your vegetable garden. But there's also companies like North Spore make what we call sawdust inoculation blocks, or blocks of sawdust that have been completely colonized with the mushroom. And then you actually just take that block, and much like you would plant a bulb, you would actually dig a hole, put that block into the ground, cover it with soil, and the mushrooms will sprout from it. So that's another easy way of, like all the hard work and the inoculation and the time has been done elsewhere. And you're basically just planting something that will sprout mushrooms. And then kind of going up a little bit in quality, you have growing mushrooms on logs. And that's a traditional method of growing mushrooms that came out of East Asia. I think it was 1,000 years ago when folks in China and Japan were experimenting with growing shiitake on logs. And now it's a very common way that people grow mushrooms, but it requires having access to freshly cut hardwoods. So that's usually, oaks, maples, deciduous trees that drop their leaves, and certain mushroom species like particular types of wood. But the process is essentially drilling holes around the circumference of a small log, filling the holes with mushroom spawn, sealing it with melted wax, and then putting those logs someplace shady to colonize over the course of a year and a half. But then over up to a decade, the log itself will sprout edible mushrooms and you can harvest them. And then probably the fourth technique that's similar difficulty would be to grow out of containers. So you would essentially treat a container like it's a log. You put straw or wood chips inside of a container, spawn into it, make sure that there are holes drilled around the circumference of the container, and then mushrooms will grow from the holes. And it's a way of having consistent harvests throughout a growing season. The process of colonization and actually growing the mushrooms is a lot faster than it is for, say, growing mushrooms on logs or even in beds.
Okay, so I'm thinking the growing mushrooms in logs is probably something I would think about doing later because that sounds like it's a little bit more involved. I would like to go back to a couple of the things that with ways that we can do this in our current garden. So the first thing you said was garden paths. So if we are mulching our garden paths, and this is like for, I would assume, in-ground gardens, but maybe those with raised beds with like wood chips on their garden paths. My thought is, are you going to walk on those? Or are there not that many that come up so that you would be able to avoid them? Like, how does that work, like as a gardener when you're walking the path?
Sure. So the cool thing about mushrooms is when they grow or have like a fruiting event is kind of how we talk about them. It usually happens all at once. So you're going to see a bunch of wine cap mushrooms or a bunch of oyster mushrooms, and you're probably going to want to harvest them before walking on your paths. But oftentimes they'll grow kind of from the areas where there isn't so much foot traffic, just on the edge of the path where your woods are meeting your garden bed. I have raised beds in my garden, and I always inoculate my garden paths, and they tend to grow from kind of like the cracks along the side of the raised beds. But yeah, I mean, you kind of keep an eye out for them, and then you might find yourself having to harvest mushrooms before getting to your plants. But it's usually an exciting event too. Like they grow very quickly. It's not like you're waiting for them to grow. It happens over the course of a day.
Wow. Okay. So you said that they all grow at once. Are they like, I mean, in vegetable gardeners' terms, are they like a determinate tomato where they all grow at once and then they don't grow anymore? Or are they more like an indeterminate where they're going to grow, but they're going to keep growing?
Kind of somewhat in between the two. So, if you get a pack of seeds, you'll often see like 28 days till maturity or 45 days till maturity. And with mushrooms, it's a little bit different. Like the kind of biological functions are somewhat different, where they're indeterminate in that they will produce many times over a course of a growing season. But the way that they're growing and when they grow is often determined by environmental conditions. So say like we get a huge rainfall, or maybe you water the paths a little bit extra, or there's a shift in temperature one night, like it gets a little cooler in the evening. Like that, those types of events will trigger the mushrooms to pop up. And that's kind of, so you're sort of, in some years it's different. Like it's not as defined as it is with plants. So I'm always expecting to be harvesting tomatoes in July, but I might be harvesting wine caps from my garden one year in May, but I might see them again at the end of June, probably again in August, maybe, once more in the fall. Like it's really, it's exciting every time because you're not necessarily expecting it. And when they grow, they tend to grow in abundance. So it's pretty fun.
That's interesting. And I think it would be fun to see how they respond to the different changes in the environment, like you said, because I've even seen that for those who are listening who have grown in straw bales. sometimes mushrooms will just pop up out of those straw bales randomly. And usually it's after a rainstorm or when it's really humid. So I can imagine that'd be fun to just see what triggers that. What I'm looking at in my garden and planting the different mushrooms that you sent me, a couple of different options are in my mind. One of them is a dedicated 4x4 raised bed that is on the north side of a pine tree, so it gets quite a bit of shade. I already have some irrigation on it. Would that be ideal for growing, like having an ideal mushroom bed, like just dedicated?
Yep. North facing beds, places where it's shady, irrigation helps. I think the point of failure for most people is that they put their mushroom grows someplace that gets baked in the sun and they're not paying attention to moisture content. So, watering, make sure that you're either watering your bed or it has some irrigation or it's someplace that just has natural ambient humidity, or you're in a climate that just gets enough periodic rainfall that you don't have to worry too much about it. That sounds like a great place. I would probably do like wine caps or something, like a thin layer of wood chips, mix in wine cap spawn. And you'll probably have all kinds of mushrooms growing.
So a couple of questions to follow up with that. When you're saying keeping it watered, like in that particular bed, I have irrigation that I have coming on every couple of days, especially in the height of the summer. Is that sufficient? You just need to keep it moist, or do you have a pattern where you water a certain amount of time per week? Does it depend on how hot it is? I mean, how do you know how often and how much water these would need, especially if you're having to do it by hand, per se?
I think most species are pretty tolerant. There are differences between species. Some are more tolerant of heat. Some are more tolerant of getting a little bit more sunlight. But I would say as long as there is some moisture content, even with a wood chip bed, if you can scrape into the wood chips and it's a little moist down there, it's cool. You could actually see the mushroom mycelium, which is the root-like structure that the mushrooms themselves grow from. If your bed is healthy, you can easily pull some of the wood chips aside and you'll see these white filaments going through the bed. And that indicates that it's healthy and thriving. They tend to be pretty resilient and you don't really have to fuss over them too much. Usually you'll just be surprised, kind of forget that you even inoculated your garden bed with them. They'll be there and you'll be excited about it. But the other thing is you can also choose to, mix in these mushrooms or your vegetable garden beds, and the mushrooms themselves will help break down organic matter, which helps feed your plants. And then the plants themselves, as they're growing, they're providing the shade and you're going to be watering your plants. So there's going to be plenty of moisture. So I'd say there's like a question of like, are you the type of person who wants to have a dedicated mushroom bed and make sure that it's getting all the attention that it deserves? Or do you want to grow mushrooms more passively by, putting them in your garden paths or putting them in your vegetable plant beds where just by the act of taking care of your garden, you're going to be growing mushrooms passively?
Yeah, you brought up something I was going to ask you about, because the other place I was thinking about inoculating, I guess that's the word, right?
Inoculating work, yeah.
My goal would be eventually like the canopy of the tomatoes with shade underneath. So if I did that, then you kind of touched on this, but I would love for you to dive into it a little bit more. Do mushrooms improve the soil health or interact with the garden crops in a healthy way?
Yeah, they do. So, mushrooms and fungi generally are essential decomposers in a garden. So they're there regardless of whether you're growing the ones that you can eat. Like there's going to be fungi in your soil. It's going to be breaking down any kind of woody material into accessible nutrients for your plants. The cool thing about adding the mushrooms that you actually want to be consuming is that you kind of get the benefits, but you also get something to harvest. But yeah, I'm a huge proponent of the soil around your plants with mushroom spawn or the mulch. So for my tomatoes, and actually I feel like I do this more with my garlic beds, because garlic needs a lot of mulch. And I'll mulch really thick with like a thick straw, and I'll mix wine cap or oyster mushroom spawn into and then while I'm waiting for my garlic scapes to come up, I'm harvesting mushrooms the whole time. And then, waiting for the garlic bulbs. And by the time the garlic bulbs are ready to harvest, the mushrooms have started to degrade that straw, feed the soil, and it just makes your garlic all the much healthier and bigger and better because you've converted the straw mulch into really accessible nutrients. And you're also getting a lot more harvest out of a smaller square footage of space. So
Yeah.
yeah, and I do that with tomatoes too, mulch with straw to keep some of the moisture in the soil and grow mushrooms while I'm waiting for my tomatoes to be harvestable.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I was thinking about was right now I just planted my tomatoes. They're probably about 18 inches tall, so they're not casting a wide canopy of shade yet. But we're in spring, so we're not super hot, but we're in the 80s. Would it still be okay as long as it had plenty of irrigation to inoculate, even though they're not shady yet?
Yeah, totally. It's still well within the time. And you can do this process like you could have started earlier in the season. You can do it through the summer as long as there's adequate moisture and shade. And then you can do it in the fall as well. So it's really kind of like a 3-season crop. But yeah, I would definitely recommend giving it a shot around your tomatoes and making sure that there's plenty of moisture so that mushroom mycelium gets established. By the time it's like really deep into the summer, you're going to have enough shade being cast by your plants that it should help keep it healthy.
Okay. Yeah. So that's what I'm hoping to do in my garden. I think it would be a lot of fun. But one thing that you mentioned was that the mushrooms start to degrade and help degrade the straw, you said when you're talking about your garlic, and started to help the soil. But is there enough, is it mycelium? I'm trying to get the terms right, to continue to produce, like you said, throughout the fall without re-inoculating?
Yes. Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I mean, often with certain species, so wine cap, I always recommend wine cap, which is a mushroom that you don't see in the grocery store, but it's basically grows these really large burgundy colored mushrooms that can be replacements for portobellos, button mushrooms. Like they're very utilitarian in the kitchen and they grow in abundance when they do grow. They're just an amazing beginner gardening mushroom because they're super prolific and really easy and tolerant of a wide range of growing conditions and climates. So I always recommend starting with those. When you do one inoculation, one season, you'll see them for multiple years. They'll just kind of get established. You'll see them popping up in woody debris areas. Like I mentioned, you can grow this mushroom underneath perennial shrubs. Sometimes they'll just establish themselves on your property. They're super beneficial to plants, not only because they release organic nutrients, but breaking down organic matter, but they also help cut down nematode pests. They're actually helpful for pest management within a garden ecosystem. They will establish themselves, but usually you only have to think about the inoculation process once for a season. And then the following season, often all you need to do is re-add your mulch. Mushroom cells and mycelium will still be alive. It will just recolonize. So you don't even necessarily have to purchase more spawn to inoculate the following year.
Just taking a quick break from my conversation with Matt to thank our sponsor, Organic Rev. If you are gardening raised beds or in the ground, you know how quickly the soil can get tired by mid to late summer. That's why I lean even more into Organic Rev to keep my garden going. Rev helps recharge your raised bed soil by boosting microbial activity, improving moisture retention, and unlocking nutrients that your plants need, right when they're starting to run low. I just mix Rev with water, 1 ounce to a gallon, but honestly, I just eyeball it. And I soak it into the soil around my plants during a deep watering. It's simple and it works. Whether I'm planting a fresh round of green beans or trying to keep my tomatoes productive in the heat, Rev helps support root systems, keeps plants greener longer, and helps them handle the stress of late summer. And if I'm adding new transplants for a fall crop, which will be coming soon, I still dip the root ball in a Rev and water mixture about 50-50 before planting. It gives them a great head start and actually helps them to manage the heat that I'm planting them in as well. So if your garden needs a mid-season boost, head to organicrev.com and use my code Jill10 to save 10% off of your order. Your soil and your harvest will thank you. All right, back to my conversation with Matt. Okay, I want to go back to the sun and shade part because there was a question that came up because we talked about shade and moisture being ideal. But if you have enough moisture but you don't have shade, will that still be okay? Or is there something about the sun that isn't good for them?
With wine caps, they tend to be sun tolerant. So that's why you can grow them in garden paths. Like garden paths will often get some sun and they'll be okay. There are certain species that have a harder time with direct sunlight. Some of the oyster varieties can start to get dry pretty quickly. But it's not like it's more of like an art. Like you can you'll get to know mushrooms once you start growing them some. Like you'll see like, okay, maybe I need to harvest these a little bit younger because they're in a kind of a sunny spot. And I know that as they grow, they're going to probably get dried out. So let's harvest these a little bit young. Or, like you'll learn that certain parts of your garden just produce an abundant flushes of mushrooms year after year. And like, that's the place that I'm focusing on because it's really hard to grow plants there, but really easy to grow mushrooms. So it's not an exact thing. Like there's definitely some flexibility and tolerance. Like, they're not going to die immediately if you forget to water them or they get hit with a little bit too much sun one day.
Well, we talked about wood chips and you mentioned straw. Can you talk a little bit about the different substrates that we want to grow these mushrooms from and just pros and cons? Because like I said, I have leaf mulch. Is that okay? Or is there a benefit to straw? Is there a benefit to wood chips? Does it depend on the mushroom? Like, speak to us about like, what are we going to grow in?
Sure. Yeah. It depends on the method too. So like I did mention, there are kind of pre-colonized sawdust blocks. And then you're not even having to worry about the substrate. You're just putting those things someplace and they'll grow mushrooms. You're either burying them or if you have an environment, you don't even necessarily need to bury them. If you're growing in the bed method, you're taking spawn and inoculating a substrate. It's really species by species. So wood chips and straw tend to be pretty universal. Most of the species of mushroom that you could cultivate in your garden will like those substrates. There's a mushroom called almond agaricus, which is like the button mushrooms that you find in the grocery store. It's the same family, but it has this really unique anise, sort of licorice scent. They're really cool. They're really tasty. But those actually like garden soil, usually with a rich garden soil. So imagine loam, but you've mixed in some fresh compost. They love that. And they like heat too. So they're really great for a summer where it's really hot and kind of humid. Like
That's why you sent that to me, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably a good one to kind of mix into your garden plants and also really great for your soil and you'll get mushrooms growing. But that one won't actually like the wood chips and straw so much. It's like the one that sort of really likes the rich compost mixture.
Would it like a leaf mulch that's shredded or not? We need to keep it with soil.
If you inoculated your soil and then you're mulching with the leaf mulch, that's fine. But it needs that kind of like rich soil compost to establish. And it will actually grow from that. But mixing in the leaf mulch is fine too. But you wouldn't want to only grow it on the leaf mulch.
But on the other hand, with wine caps, for example, all that's needed is wood chips.
Yeah, wood chips.
Is that what you're saying?
You can grow leaf mulch too. Leaf mulch tends to not have as high a nitrogen content. So they're not going to be like, they'll grow. I've actually used wine cap to break down leaf piles in my yard just as like a way of naturally kind of breaking it down into soil so that I can compost or use that compost on my plants. But the mushrooms themselves will tend to not be as abundant or as big as if you're growing them on straw or wood chips.
Is the straw okay as is, or does it need to be more fine than you would get in a bale?
You can grow from straw that's in a bale. I've even done like straw bale gardening where I've put mushroom spawn into the garden bale along with the plants and grow mushrooms that way. But usually I'll use chopped straw. So like you can find often like kind of like garden, like mulch straw that has been chopped a little bit finer. That will work better. It's easier for the mycelium to kind of access and break it down, but it's not a deal breaker if you only have access to straw bales. And I will say like, even like thinking about, growing mushrooms out of straw bales because you do straw bale gardening. The cool thing about mushrooms too, is that they're really adaptable for experimentation. And I think, more and more gardeners are kind of jumping into growing mushrooms, but it's still a tiny percentage of us that are doing it. So there's a lot to learn, a lot to experiment with, and it's kind of an exciting crop to integrate into your garden for that reason alone.
Yeah, and I'm excited to just be talking to you about this because I've never tried it because it's always seemed so intimidating for me. But my husband and my son love mushrooms. So I thought, this would be great for me to try. I would like to ask you about, from a culinary perspective, I did see some information about this on your website, but I would love for you to share, like, what do we expect from the different types of mushrooms? I know that you sent me 3 different types of oyster: blue oyster, yellow, pink, the almond agaricus, and the wine cap. And I know you have a lot more than that, but what are we looking at compared to a button mushroom that we get at the grocery store, or a portobello or a shiitake or something like that? What can we expect?
Yeah, I mean, I think so most of the mushrooms you find at the grocery store, the ones I kind of commonly associate with the grocery store, the button mushrooms, the creminis, and the portobellos. And all 3 of those are actually the exact same species of mushroom. So it's like the magic of marketing that kind of differentiates them, but they're just the same mushroom at different growth states. So like a portobello is an adult cremini mushroom.
Okay.
So the cool thing is that like there is as much diversity in the world of mushrooms as there is in the world of plants or animals or any of these other biological kingdoms. And most people only are kind of thinking about this one singular species when they're thinking about edible mushrooms. You did mention shiitake, so that would be a separate species. But
Okay.
that's all to say that there's a huge variety of flavors and textures and kind of like culinary uses of mushrooms, from like the really esoteric. Like there are mushrooms that they're not easy to grow in the garden, but they have like the scent of maple syrup and you can make baked goods with them. And then there's ones that are incredibly meaty and are packed with umami. And, like if you grow shiitakes on logs, they'll grow to the size of portobello mushrooms. They look nothing like the ones that you see in the grocery store, and their flavor is richer and more interesting. So yeah, it's kind of an exciting world. Like it's sort of like opening up this whole new world of flavors and textures when you start to grow them in your garden. And I think like, people who don't like mushrooms or say they don't like mushrooms, I always try to push back and give them some recipes to try to prove otherwise. Because I think a lot of people who feel like they don't like mushrooms, like maybe they've only had button mushrooms and they've only had them prepared in a way that they're slimy or chewy or like the texture's off and the flavor's off. But, there's this huge diversity of other species that have different textures, different flavors that are worth experimenting with. And maybe you absolutely despise the mushrooms in the grocery store, but you find something that you really love to grow in your garden.
That's what I'm hopeful for because I keep trying to like mushrooms and I don't hate them like I don't like fresh tomatoes. I know that's crazy. So I'm actually kind of excited about trying these and seeing if I can grow to love them because I do know they're healthy. I mean, aren't they pretty healthy for you?
Oh yeah, I think they sort of walk the line of both being food and medicine. Whole cultures where they prescribe mushroom supplements for particular ailments. The cool thing is like you can just enjoy them as food and get those benefits from them. I feel like for cooking mushrooms, the one trick that I think people should pay attention to is actually cooking them long enough. I feel like mushrooms are chewy or slimy. It's probably because they're undercooked and they need a little bit more time because they should be like crispy and meaty and like, yeah, super flavorful. They should never be slimy. So,
Okay.
yeah.
You mentioned that the mushrooms, when they come up, a lot of times they'll come up all at once. So I'm thinking like the preserving mindset of me is like, well, how am I going to use all of these? If I have too many to use fresh for a couple of nights, number one, how long do they keep? Like, how long are they going to store in the refrigerator? And then number two, I mean, what do you do to preserve them if you still can't use them up in time?
Sure. Yeah, they last, I say like a good week in the fridge. The best way to preserve fresh mushrooms in the fridge is to put them into a paper bag. Kind of like close off the paper bag and just stick them in the fridge.
Like a brown paper bag?
Yeah,
Okay.
helps regulate the humidity so they don't get soggy or rot. They're pretty adaptable. So you can dry them in a dehydrator and store them for the winter. I do a lot of that and then I'll use them in soups throughout the off season. You can saute them in butter and then freeze them. So you could use a vacuum sealer and just freeze, add some fat, olive oil or lard, sauteing the mushrooms and freeze really well. Some more interesting ways, pickle mushrooms. You can either do a vinegar-based pickle or if you're adventurous, a lacto-fermented pickle of mushrooms.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything I feel like those are like the primary ways.
Yeah, I would say dehydrating and freezing would be very accessible. Those are pretty easy ways to preserve. And I'm also thinking about this just because I think we've been conditioned to fear mushrooms to some degree. Like I have a tree that we cut down and it's growing mushrooms out of it, but I'm not going to touch them because I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
Is there anything to be afraid of regarding, I mean, obviously the ones that you're selling safe for culinary use, but is there anything that I need to know that could make them bad or any kind of risk?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, mushrooms, like you want to know what you're picking, like with anything. So we feel comfortable growing tomatoes, which are part of the deadly nightshade family, and you'd never want to eat a nightshade in the wilds because it could be poisonous. It's true, like you're cultivating an edible variety, but when you're harvesting them, just make sure that the species that you're harvesting from the ground and the species that we cultivate don't have like these deadly lookalikes, right? They're very clearly the species that you're trying to cultivate. So yeah, I think the first thing is just, make sure that what you're harvesting looks like the thing you're trying to grow, line it up and you'll be good there. And then mushrooms should be cooked. I mean, I know some people see mushroom salad bars and stuff, but even the mushroom salad bars should be cooked. Your body actually can't digest the mushroom fiber unless it's been cooked. It just allows it to be digestible. And then there's certain species, all ones that are like wild forest mushrooms that are poisonous until you cook them. But the ones that we've grown in the garden are just be a lot tastier if they're cooked and more nutritious.
That's encouraging. And I'm just excited in chatting with you to be able to try this. I think it's going to be so much fun. So to finish up, I want to just kind of ask you to summarize for a beginner who hasn't yet watched any of your YouTube videos or read any of the information on your website, which I did a little bit, so I have a little bit of an idea. But for someone who is just listening to this for the first time, what is the easiest way for them to start? And do you have any particular advice that maybe we haven't covered yet as far as helping them get started?
Sure. I would definitely start with one of the easiest species. I would start with wine caps and do like the garden bed thing, or maybe some oyster mushrooms if those seem appealing. Like they're very easy to grow. But before doing any of that, like you kind of mentioned watching some of our videos, we have an abundance of educational material that we write about mushroom growing extensively on our website, which is northspore.com. And then we actually have a full in-house like content teams. We have 2 videographers, we have a writer. We put out a ton of material for YouTube about doing all of this stuff. And I promise that it's easy. It's very easy to have a lot of success, and then you'll probably become addicted to growing mushrooms. You want to keep doing it, but start with the easy stuff. And when you feel confident in that, then you can expand. There's all kinds of mushroom species to experiment with and different techniques that you can advance into.
I can hear the passion in your voice. So one more quick question. What is it about mushrooms that has made you so passionate about this one thing to grow?
Well, I got into mushrooms when I was young. So I was a teenager. I started foraging for edible mushrooms. So I can go out into the woods and collect edible mushrooms and have enough knowledge to do that safely. And I didn't start cultivating them until I was in my late 20s and had already started North Spore. So North Spore was kind of my introduction to growing mushrooms. And it's been 11 years of kind of learning, diving into it more and more. I've been a gardener my whole life and just never realized that I could be growing mushrooms in my garden and that my garden would appreciate mushrooms being grown in it. So it's really this kind of symbiotic relationship between mushrooms and plants and humans. And it's kind of fun to be able to experiment and do something that not a lot of people do.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this with me. I'm hoping that the weather cooperates this weekend and I can get mine inoculated and going. And if I have any questions along the way, I'll reach out to you. But for those of you guys who are listening, I'll definitely give you an update shortly on what actually ended up happening in my garden. So thank you so much for joining me today, Matt.
Thank you, Jill.
It has been about 6 weeks since I first spoke to Matt, where he gave me all the instructions on how to plant the mushrooms he had sent me. And I wanted to give you an update. This has been such a fascinating journey. He sent me 3 blocks of oyster mushrooms, blue oyster, pink oyster, and yellow oyster. And he sent me 2 bags of wine cap and almond agaricus spawn. Now, when I opened all of this, I had no idea there was really a difference in the spawn and the blocks. So the blocks are basically ready to go. You just plant the blocks right in your garden, which is what I did. They already have the substrate they need and they are ready to go. All you have to do is plant it. And when I say plant it, I read the instructions. I buried it in the soil about halfway, but then the rest of the block was about halfway up. The places that I chose to plant these were in different raised beds. I planted my blue and yellow oyster by my celery, potato, and okra. My thought behind this was, yes, that bed is in full sun, but it's going to get a lot of shade with the okra and the celery and the potatoes until I harvested those. And that actually worked really well. And then I planted the pink oyster underneath my blackberries. And in that bed, they'll get a little more shade just because we have a couple of trees that are nearby. But for the most part, hoping that the blackberries will give that a little bit more shade. I was shocked when I started seeing mushrooms popping within a week. And I was actually out of town when they were ready to harvest, but my family, my son and my husband harvested them and they put them in a hibachi meal while I was gone. They took pictures and everything while I was out of town. And the big question was, how did they taste? That was a big thing because they didn't look like your regular mushrooms that you buy at the grocery store, especially these yellow ones. The blue ones weren't actually blue. They were more gray, so they were a little bit more normal colored. But both of them said they tasted just fine. They tasted like regular mushrooms. So that was a win in my book, just because I'm not really a huge fan of mushrooms in general, so I wouldn't have been able to really tell the difference. I'm hoping that I can learn to like them a little bit more, especially as I'm growing them. But one thing I did notice was that if you don't harvest them quickly, especially if it's rainy, they will get large. And then as soon as the rain stops, they started drying out pretty quickly. So a couple of times I wasn't able to get them all harvested, mainly because of my error for sure. And they ended up drying out. But what I noticed is that with each rain, they continued to pop up. So definitely I was seeing how important moisture is. We'll see how it goes throughout the summer. When we get some dry spells, I've noticed that they dry out. The humidity isn't necessarily helping things, but it has been really neat to see how they really do respond to that rain. Now, the almond agaricus, they were planted a little bit differently. They didn't come in blocks. They come in a bag, and you basically just sprinkle that spawn wherever you're going to plant it. I planted the wine cap in its own 4x4 raised bed on the north side of a tree, which is what Matt had recommended. And nothing yet. I don't see anything popping up yet, but I believe that's to be expected. From what I understand, it takes a little bit longer for those to get going compared to the ready-made blocks. I could be wrong, but that was my experience. And then I ended up planting the almond agaricus under my tomatoes, and I had a little bit extra, and I planted some under my brassicas. And I think one of the two, I can't remember now, I ended up just sprinkling under my blueberry bushes because I had some extra. We'll see if they come up. They haven't come up yet, but we'll see. But I'm hoping to get some harvest in the fall for both of those. Now, obviously, this is all just my first experience, and I began in the spring. I have many more months to continue testing this out. But initially, with what I've already seen and already harvested, they were so much fun. So if this is something that you want to test out in your garden, I highly recommend North Spore mushrooms. Of course, they're the only ones I've tried, but I really like the product that I got, especially the ones in the blocks that spawned really quickly. And we'll put their website address in the show notes for you to check them out. Another thing I would recommend is going to their YouTube channel. They have some beginner-friendly YouTube videos that I found really helpful, and I watched those even before I talked to Matt. So that if you're completely clueless about all of this, like I was, those videos were really helpful to get an idea of so I would know a little bit what I was doing. But overall, it definitely helped talking to Matt himself and getting this information before I planted. So we'll see if it's something that I'm able to continue to do and continue to enjoy. But so far, it's been a lot of fun. And if you're interested in doing this, I hope that this episode has been helpful for you to get started. I would love to hear your experience, whether you have already planted mushrooms or you're curious about doing it. You can always send me a DM at The Beginner's Garden at Instagram, and I would love to hear from you. Or you can reply to any of my Friday emails that I send to you. And if you aren't getting my Friday emails, you can go to journeywithjill.net/garden signup. And those emails just share what's going on in my garden from week to week and also gives you new content like podcasts and YouTube and blog posts and all of that. So anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode and I will chat with you again next week. I hope you have a great day.